Hey, this is Pastor Josiah from Career First Baptist Church, and this is our ongoing weekly video Bible study. Today we'll be looking at Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. So I would say, I always try to give a little lead in with these. If you haven't been with us in this series, I would say at least try to watch the first parts of Habakkuk chapter 2, if not the whole thing before diving in here. But yeah, you can jump in here if this is your first one you're seeing, that's fine. I'll try to tie you back to what we've already talked about. But let's go ahead and get into scripture here. These are verses 12 through 17, and then we're going to talk about them. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So, in this, God, Yahweh, continues to respond to Habakkuk's sort of question about, are you going to let these righteous people go unchecked? And God is kind of continuing to outline what befalls people who live in the way that these marauders that are sort of coming to destroy Israel live. But remember, we talked about this last time. There's almost two layers of critique here. Okay, first of all, God's talking about justice for the wicked. For those people who are living in the ways that are described in these verses. In this case, it's the people coming in from the outside, who are coming to conquer Israel. But at the same time, these statements are also meant to cause Habakkuk and the people particularly the people he's reporting back to be self-reflective. These things are true of this outside force that's God's going to use to deliver justice to unrighteous Israel. But they're also true of Israel. So God's sort of holding up a mirror. Here are all the bad things about these people, and those things are bad. We're not going to question that, right? But where do you see yourself in this, Israel? Where do you see yourself? How are you also like this? So that's kind of what's going on here in terms of bigger narrative, okay? Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. So actually, we'll do 13 too. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, and that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? So this is a pretty pointed critique towards both this group of people that are coming in to attack Israel and also against Israel itself. The point here is that when your nation is established or built on a foundation of bloodshed, that's not a good thing. When your city or your nation is defined by its injustice, that's not a good thing. There are going to be consequences, both the natural actions and responses that happen as a result of the things you're doing poorly, and there are also going to be divine consequences, right? There are bad things that are going to happen when you build your nation on bloodshed. Now, God here is making a difference and a distinction. There were moments in the history of Israel where he said, go to war with these people. In almost all those cases, those people had been given an opportunity to hear and understand Yahweh, to hear and understand their part in things, and they had either rejected it or in most cases had decided to not just reject what God had, but also to make themselves the enemy of Israel, to intentionally strike out against them. There are moments where God sort of sanctions those things. So what he's talking about here are those who seek bloodshed, not when God has ordained that it should happen. So that's an important distinction to make. I think one that we need to understand and see here, that's true both of the Assyrians who are coming in to conquer and also of Israel, because there were plenty of fights that Israel picked when God told them not to. and that's a problem. There are plenty of fights that Israel picked when God told them not to. So every time Israel goes to war in the Old Testament, it's not always according to God, or even when they do it, they don't do it the way God asked them to. So that's an important distinction. God only sends Israel to war when it's absolutely necessary to build this nation that God intended to draw other people to himself. So in a sense, the only time God sends Israel to war is to, in a sense, trim the weeds so that they can get the sunlight they need to grow, to have room to exist as a nation. And that's the only time. He doesn't send them to war to conquer more territory. He doesn't send them to war to amass more riches. He doesn't send them to war to capture people and enslave them. None of those things are in the heart of God when war has to happen. So those motivations for war are bunk. Basically, God's saying that's not what you want. And here come the Assyrians who have built a foundation of that, right? And so God's saying, yes, there are going to be consequences and negative things to them. Woe to them. But also woe to Israel when you act like that. That's not good. Has not the God, Lord Almighty, determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? Again, this is another statement from God about sort of my will is going to be done. Your planning and the fights you pick are accomplishing nothing. All you're doing is essentially burning yourself out for nothing. So all these wars and politicking and things you want to do with one another, those are not things that I have ordained. And so God's being very clear about that these are useless efforts, useless conflicts, both the ones the Assyrians are stirring up and quite possibly the ones Israel has stirred up with its neighbors unnecessarily. So God's given them a harsh word here, and I think that's important for them. And it's probably important to us to some degree, not to get into politics too much or anything like that, but to put things in their appropriate and proper perspective and to understand that just because some people think that we should go to war or that war would benefit a country or a group of people, that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel should have done it. And it doesn't mean that we as Christians should do it. We should be very contemplative and very, very slow to step into those kind of spaces. Because God is quite explicit, and the times that he has called people to war in scripture, it is very, very obvious that he is the one doing the calling. So I'm very skeptical when other people try to say, oh, God wants us to go fight this war, because in history, when God has wanted his people to fight wars, he's told them very explicitly when and how. So we just need to be careful. We need to be discerning. That's all. So I'm not saying war is bad or unnecessary on its face. I do think it's quite terrible. But God sometimes sends his people to war, not always and not often. And when he does, he makes it very clear that that's what he's doing. So the rebuke here is primarily for both Israel and the Assyrians, who are pushing these things for their own reasons, according to their own agendas. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the water covers the sea. That's verse 14. And it's really talking about the inevitability of people knowing about God, people knowing about Yahweh. They may not yet, in Habakkuk's time, know all these things, but they will. They will come to know these things. And so he's trying to say that don't go to war, don't pick fights for that reason. This is the real thing that's going on, is people finding out about me, and that is going to happen. It doesn't need you to happen. People will know about me. It's going to happen. It's probably going to happen more if you're faithful. But here in verse 14, it's really just about there's an inevitability. It's really a statement about God's sovereignty and power as much as it is people knowing about him and the way we think about it. But again, the point here is you're burning yourselves out for nothing, because ultimately I'm in charge, and those things which I have decreed are going to happen. And so why behave like this? Why be like this? So we get a little bit of a tone change in verse 15. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. At verse 16, you will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. So This is another rebuke or indictment of both of these cultures. But woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from wineskin until they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. That's a statement about taking advantage of other people. That's a statement about manipulating other people, about bringing something in the guise of kindness and then using it to manipulate people for your own gains, which is never good. So the indictment here is not about drinking, right? If you just read, woe to him who gives drinks to his neighbors, you haven't understood the full passage. The issue is here, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. So woe to those who abuse others, woe to those who use their power to manipulate others, woe to those who essentially come as a friend, but treat you in ways that are duplicitous. I can't find the word. Treacherous. Let's go with treacherous. So that's what we need to watch out for, that behavior. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around you, and disgrace will cover your glory. So God is essentially saying here, if you've behaved like this, get ready, because it's coming your way. You are about to be exposed for what you are, for the truth of how you've behaved. This one's probably a little more pointedly towards Israel, because Assyria wasn't making any secrets of how it operated. They were quite feared, and feared for a good reason. But here, it seems to be that the lens is being turned a little bit more towards Israel. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. So in this process of being invaded and attacked and conquered, God is exposing the inadequacy. God is exposing those things that they aren't doing as they should. And so this is supposed to be an opportunity to kind of look at the mirror and say, oh my gosh, look how far we've fallen from where God would have us. So that's it. That's the idea here. God's trying to explain to Habakkuk that this is why these things are happening, because through this, you are going to be humbled. Your shame, you're going to be filled with shame instead of glory. You're going to be taken down a notch, essentially. Verse 17 kind of wraps up this little section, although there is a little bit more of chapter 2. The violence you've done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you've shed human blood, and you've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So this is probably turned a little bit more pointedly back towards the invaders. So we're kind of dipping in and out here. But this is God saying to Habakkuk in no uncertain terms, there will be consequences for these folks. They aren't going to get away scot-free, but God is still using them to accomplish some of his purposes, even in their savagery. So, but it's a pretty straightforward read here. The violence you've done to Lebanon will overwhelm you. Your destruction of animals will terrify you. Here, by the way, Lebanon really just means that whole region. You know, he's speaking broadly about this territory that these people have swept through. You have shed human blood. You've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So, yeah, basically, this is going to come back to you. It's this way of living, this way of being, this way of existing. There will be consequences for that, for these people. So God is answering Habakkuk's question. No, they're not going to get off scot-free. You know, that's the biggest question Habakkuk, really the people challenging Habakkuk seem to have. So yeah, so that's what we've got today for 12 through 17. I mean, legitimately, this is kind of just restating ideas that we've kind of already covered in chapter 2. It's being repeated for emphasis, and it's being repeated again to give his audience, the people God is speaking to now, the opportunity to see themselves in these invaders, to see their own wickedness mirrored in the wickedness of outsiders, people not of God. So God's trying to communicate to them, hey, this is how much you look like not my people sometimes. So in this process, that's something you're supposed to be noticing, as well as this whole, the actual physical reality of being attacked and conquered. So something to think about. This is, it's pretty heavy because they're going through some hard stuff. So, if you come out of this not feeling uplifted or without an encouraging message, I think that's kind of God's point. And I think it should challenge us to be reflective, even as Christians, knowing that we are redeemed, but that we yet struggle in brokenness. I think it's a challenge to us to remember our own struggles before we're quick to condemn those of other people. which sounds very surface level, but it's a real challenge for us sometimes. Sometimes we start to think, well, I know Jesus, so I'm better than that person. But that isn't the gospel. The gospel is that none of us are righteous, and it's only by Christ that we are made whole. And our status as redeemed does not set us above anyone else. We are still broken. We still struggle. It's Christ who is above all of us. So we ought to treat one another with mercy, kindness, and patience. I think maybe that's our reflective piece from this as sort of modern readers, and not those who are about to experience what Habakkuk was about to experience. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks for joining, and I will look forward. I should be back with you with another video next Friday, and then there will be another week off on the 19th as I will be out of town. So thanks for joining in, and I'll see you soon.